All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lori Wingate. I'm the Executive Director of the Evaluation Center, and I'm going to be doing my best to fill in for our usual moderator today, Samantha Hooker. So welcome to our final cafe of the 2025-26 academic year. We've really enjoyed having such a wonderful lineup of speakers and a wide range of topics, and really appreciate every single one of you who shows up and really contributes to this conversation. So thank you. So in just a little bit, I'm going to add a link to the chat so that if you're not already on our Eval Cafe mailing list, you can get on it and you will know as soon as we put our next year's series together. Before we begin, we do like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the land that we're on. Western Michigan University is located on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, which was historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. We honor their stewardship and connection to this land. Today, we are so excited to welcome the Evaluation Center's very own Brianna Hook Singletary to the Eval Cafe stage. Brianna is a senior research associate here at Western Michigan University. She's joined by her colleagues, Malitsitso Moteane, who is a postdoctoral research associate at Winston-Salem State University, and Jaylin Nesbitt, a research associate at WestEd. So if you have any questions during the presentation, you can use the Q&A button in the Zoom tools or in the chat, and you can enter those at any time as you think of them. I'm going to be keeping an eye on those to make sure they're addressed. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters and get started. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me just have 1 second to get my screen set up, that we can go ahead and get started. Share. Oops, sorry. Can you guys see the presentation? Sounds good. So I will hand it over to Jaylin to get us started.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be doing a talk titled "Who Counts? Rethinking Validity, Voice, and Power in Educational Measurement and Evaluation." And before we get started, it's good for you guys to know who's presenting. So we'll do like some brief introductions and I'll start. So my name is Jaylin Nesbitt. I am originally from New Jersey. I'm currently living in Towson, Maryland. My background is in psychology. I obtained my bachelor's of science from Spelman College, and then I went on to get my master's in quantitative psychology from James Madison University. Um, and currently, I am a research associate at WestEd, where I focus on assessment research, specifically in the K-12 space. So I do different data analyses. I also do some qualitative research by doing interviews with students and using that information to inform different educational products and tools and processes. And I'll pass it on to Brianna.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna Hook Singletary. My background is in education and educational research methodology. I'm currently a senior research associate at the Evaluation Center, where I work on the Evaluate project and work a lot with developing learning resources for those who are implementers and receivers of evaluation. And I'll hand it over to Malitsitso.
Hi, everyone. My name is Malitsitso Moteane. I am a former math teacher, is always where I start my story, but I did a PhD in educational research methodology. Currently, I work as a research associate in a Department of Psychological Sciences at Winston-Salem State University, where I'm working on the validation of a tool designed to measure school-based racism, stress, and trauma. I guess it'll be clear as we go through our presentation, but a lot of the work that we did here in this research project influences kind of thinking about validity and validation as I'm implementing it in my work, but also as we interact with tools that we work in. Not with us today is Dr. Janine Haynes, who is also a psychometrician, but also comes from an educational background, and she's currently working in the Maryland School District as an English teacher. Back to Jaylin.
Okay, so before getting into the weeds of the presentation, we wanted to start with a few definitions that guide our work and we'll also discuss throughout our time together today. And so the first term is educational measurement, which is the science and practice of gathering information about student knowledge, skills, abilities, and interests. It encompasses how that information is collected, evaluated for quality, and communicated to relevant audiences. Constructing assessments, psychometrics, and data analyses, different types of evaluation, standardized testing, and educational accountability are all included under the umbrella of educational measurement. And then we have validity, which refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretations of test scores for proposed uses of tests. It has to do with the underlying rationale for our interpretation and uses of test scores. And so in other words, it really has to do with both the meaning of test scores and then how we also use them. Validity is justifiably the most fundamental consideration in developing tests and evaluating tests. And when thinking about evaluation specifically, validity is about whether our conclusions are trustworthy, whether the evidence we gathered actually supports what we're claiming, and whether those claims are being used in ways that are appropriate for the context. And then we have constructs. It's a theoretical entity hypothesized to account for particular behaviors or characteristics of people, such as anxiety, or math knowledge, creativity, intelligence, different abilities and attitudes, personality characteristics, as well as value systems. And so an evaluator may assess whether a program improves a person's self-efficacy, motivation, critical thinking, or sense of belonging. And although these are some personal characteristics, in addition to these person level constructs, evaluators may also explore program quality, implementation fidelity, or organizational capacity. And then finally, bias reflects the influence of construct irrelevant variation on item responses. And a common example that demonstrates this is using unnecessarily complex language in a math item. Some test takers might miss that item because not because they don't understand mathematics, but because they don't understand the language. And so in addition to measuring math, you might also be measuring some form of language ability, which is the unintended construct. And so when that happens, it's typically biased towards students that are more comfortable in that language when the assessment should be focused on math. Next slide. Okay, and we wanted to do like a brief history of measurement, which kind of gets us motivated to continue to do this work, just thinking about where we were and where we might still have to go. And so we often treat psychometrics as a neutral technical enterprise, but its origins often tell us a very different story. The mathematical infrastructure of the field, such as correlation, regression, the measurement of human traits, was built by Francis Galton in the 1880s, which was explicitly done to advance eugenics. The tools came first, and then they came with a specific agenda. Binet's 1905 intelligence scale was a rare exception. It was designed to identify children who needed more support, not to rank human worth. But when Lewis Terman adopted it for American schools in 1916, that humanitarian purpose was replaced with claims about innate and heritable intelligence, which was mapped directly onto race and class. The consequences of these assessments became policy, and so during World War I, over 1.7 million men were tested using the Army Alpha and Beta, and the results were used to argue for racial hierarchy and help drive the Immigration Act of 1924, which is one of the most explicitly discriminatory pieces of legislation in American history. Psychometrics did not just reflect those beliefs, but it provided us with numbers with how to justify them. And by the civil rights era, the courts were asked to reckon with the schools what they had been doing for decades. So cases like Larry P. versus Riles exposed how testing had been used to sort Black children into dead-end tracks. Those legal battles are part of what pushed the field toward bias detection methods, including differential item functioning research, that we still rely on and use today. Messick 1989 validity framework was the field's most serious attempt to own these consequences, arguing that validity must include the social impact of how scores are used. This complicated history is what brought our team together with hopes that we can take different steps to rectify these pervasive inequities that the field has played a huge role in perpetuating. And now we're going to try to connect this to evaluation. And so many early evaluation theorists were actually psychometricians. Methods branch of Alkin's tree features Ralph Tyler, who was foundational to testing and measurement tradition in education. Also James Poppin, which was the leading voice in criterion reference measurement. Lee Cronbach, known for Cronbach's alpha generalizability theory, and Donald Campbell, who focused on convergent and discriminant validity. As evaluators, we often use observed performance to make inferences about the underlying constructs, such as math performance, mental health, and this is usually depicted in the image as psychometric inference. In this, we depend on the reported or assumed validity of the instruments we use for the populations we use them in. And specifically, as evaluators, we take the observed performance further and make a causal inference that scores are a result of the program. Large-scale educational evaluations often use psychometric analyses, such as item response theory, and they often create their own instruments, which also employ some of these methods like factor analyses and reliability analysis.
Thank you. And so we just wanted to connect this to our research. So engaging with this history, kind of the first prong of our research was thinking about ourselves as who we are and kind of engaging with the history of measurement. And so that led to one of the studies we'll be reporting on today, where we used our personal testimonials as part of our methodology to look at the history of measurement and kind of chart where we go forward. Secondly, we borrowed from what is prominent in the evaluation tradition, this concept of nobody knows my name, where the idea is to lift and highlight the contributions of Black scholars in evaluation theory. And our wondering was kind of what was happening in psychometrics. And so those are also studies that we'll be reporting on today. We also had this thought around our other students experiencing this history in the same way that we did. And so we did a survey study where we surveyed students who are in educational measurement or psychometrics. And then kind of another outlet was to interview Black professionals in psychometrics, so either professors or professional psychometricians, on their experiences, how they make sense of the disconnect that we kind of see, or, you know, engaging with the dark history of psychometrics. And then lastly, we are going to report a little bit on a study that kind of tries to use all of this. So this knowledge of the history, this idea of maybe people who are excluded from the curricula or curricula on educational measurement, and kind of digs deeper into differential item functioning as it relates to race and ethnicity. So like I mentioned, we're only going to talk about a portion of the findings from our different projects or different studies. And the first one is this revisiting of psychometrics history from a Black scholar's perspective. In this study, we intentionally engage critical race theory, and we use specifically this idea of testimonials. So this idea that the researcher is not an objective tool and engaging their personal experiences as well. We did a historical mapping of the history of educational measurement or psychometrics. We added our personal narratives, and we also had focus groups to kind of talk through and make sense of our findings. So while we were all three Black scholars, we did identify a little bit differently. One of the researchers was African born and raised. on the African continent. The other was a first generation Jamaican American, and the third researcher was a Southern born and raised African American. So we came to the study at different points in our careers. Two of us started the study while we were in graduate school, while the third researcher had graduated and was already working in the field. We also came to educational measurement programs at different points in our lives. Two of us had worked as teachers and or teacher trainers before our grad studies, while one of us progressed straight through undergraduate degree to the master's program. We also came from different educational measurement programs. So while two of us came from a PWI, another researcher, the third researcher attended an HBCU. We can go to the next slide. So our individual testimonials revealed commonalities in our lived experiences as Black women, but also revealed differences aligned with the ways in which our unique cultural backgrounds would inform that. And the three major themes that we found in our studies was, first of all, this idea of disillusionment. So I think we all came to educational measurement thinking it was this objective, kind of neutral field, and kind of having this disillusionment around the history, so the prior connection with eugenics, but also I think the assumed importance of deficit-based thinking that is embedded within the profession. And so the first thing that came to us was the disillusionment. Engaging our testimonials allowed us to also surface a dissonance that probably we wouldn't have been able to. And so we all were in graduate school or had been through graduate school and had, personal academic achievements. But in our daily work, in our schoolwork, we had to be confronted with this almost underlying assumption that Black people were inferior in a way, right? And so having to deal with knowing ourselves and knowing our own achievements, but then having to constantly reiterate or harp on this assumed deficiency also created a lot of dissonance amongst us, and also led us to kind of wonder, right? Like, which evidence weighs more? Why is it that we afford more evidence to the technical kind of findings as opposed to our personal stories or personal narratives? We also realized through the study that we had to develop scholar activism. And so to actively engage who we are and our counter narratives in the work that we do. And I think it's led all of us to kind of approach our careers from that scholar activist perspective, as evidenced by this line of research, but also in our personal work, not assuming that the objectivity of our technical work and also being the voice that surfaces those differences. And so we do have a quote there on the slide, which is one of the biggest things that we gained from undertaking the study, not just learning about the history individually, but collectively, and also engaging our testimonials, is understanding that the history of psychometrics led me to a critical realization that these tests were never designed with our achievement in mind, but were crafted to maintain a social and political hierarchy. I think I hand over to Brianna for some more findings of the,
All right. So as Malitsitso said before, a big part of our research has been learning more about the contributions of Black scholars in educational measurement. And again, this really matters for evaluation because the way we measure shapes how we define success, interpret results, and make decisions. And so when certain perspectives are missing, evaluations can end up incomplete or even biased. So even though we all had taken several measurement courses, we realized that we had learned very little about scholars who looked like us. That gap really stood out, especially knowing that Black psychometricians did exist and have been making important contributions for a long time, even though their work hasn't always been recognized or included in the mainstream conversations. So to learn more, we conducted two studies focused on the contributions of Dr. Robert Lee Williams and Dr. Lloyd Bond. We used a historical research approach that included document reviews and reflective journaling. We were guided by a few key questions. What were their contributions to educational measurement theory and practice? What ideas or theories shaped their work? How were their contributions received within the psychometric community? And how did their work influence future research in the field? So, starting with Dr. Williams, we learned that his work really highlighted systemic inequities in intelligence testing, especially how those tests impacted Black students. He was also a strong advocate through the Association of Black Psychologists, or the APA, and worked to, sorry, the ABPSI, and worked to address challenges faced by Black graduate students. His contributions pushed the field to take bias in testing more seriously and helped move things towards more culturally responsive assessment. He also advocated for the recognition of African American English, or as he called it, Ebonics, which was a shift in how language and ability were understood in testing. For Dr. Bond, his work focused on several key areas, including bias in mental testing and how to better evaluate culturally responsive teaching practices. He was also involved in work around teacher certification through the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. His research looked at factors that influence how students perform on assessments, and he contributed more broadly to conversations about standardized testing, item selection, and group differences. One of his key messages was really about what happens when tests miss the mark and the need to move towards culturally responsive approaches to assessment. We have more information about this, so if you're interested, we'd be happy to share our previous presentations where we go more in depth into the theoretical roots of their contributions and how their work was received in the field. But as for today's presentation, we felt like highlighting their contributions was most relevant. So really overall, this part of our research is really an effort just to shine light on those contributions that we don't often hear about and to show that whose knowledge we center in measurement truly matters. And that has direct implications for how we approach fairness and bias in evaluation. But with that in mind, I'm going to hand it back over to Malitsitso.
Thank you, Bree. And so the last study that we are going to share some findings from was critically exploring the use of race and ethnicity as grouping variables in differential item functioning studies. And so what I was interested when looking at this was, how is race and ethnicity defined in published peer-reviewed journal articles that talk about differential item functioning? And then also, how is it operationalized? The study was a systematic literature review and was unapologetically engaged in critical race quantitative intersectionality. Before, or just to make sure we're on the same page, we could, I think there's a need to kind of differentiate between bias as we think about it, maybe in evaluation or just in general in life, and also how we think about it in terms of psychometrics and then also statistics. So in the broader sense, right, ethical or social bias is that refers to an outcome that unfairly impacts certain groups, resulting in unequal access to resources and opportunity. And that's kind of how we think about it as we go through our evaluation work. But in terms of psychometrics, as we engage the history, we found that there was a point where, because of these legal challenges to tests or the use of tests for selection in employment, in higher education, in specialized programs, there was a need to be more and more technical about what bias actually is. And so when we think about psychometric biases, it's when a test item functions differently across groups without being relevant to the construct that is being measured, which is how Jaylin defined it at the beginning. But when we drill down into differential item functioning, it's this idea that this happens systematically across all abilities, right? So if two students who have the same standing on a specific construct systematically perform differently or respond differently to an item, according to which group that they belong to, then we say that it's differential item functioning. So fully aware that this is a very minute part of what bias is, we still were interested in looking at how do researchers or how do psychometricians or whoever is doing this research, how do they define race and ethnicity and how do they operationalize it? Because the aim of these studies is to show that these tests are fair or that these tests are not biased or that these tests do not show differential item functioning. And so the findings were that in terms of how do they even conceptualize the terms race and ethnicity, very few of the studies, only a quarter, provided operational definitions or theoretical justifications for why they're using race and ethnicity as a grouping variable when they do these studies. Most of the definitions aligned with census definitions, and almost none of them acknowledge this notion that race and ethnicity are socially constructed. And so in a lot of the studies, they were kind of treated as natural biological categories. In terms of operationalization, most of the studies, so 57%, allowed participants to self-select their race and ethnicity, while 30% didn't specify. And this seems like an innocuous finding, but some of the constructs that were being measured were not just about how participants behave, right? A lot of it, some of them were also related to how they are treated. And so allowing participants to self-select the race or ethnicity they identify with doesn't always explain whatever differential item functioning we see, because sometimes it's how they're perceived and not necessarily how they perceive themselves. A lot of most of the studies focused on binary comparisons, and of course, not of course, but the most commonly studied comparisons were Black versus white, which kind of attends to the history, because a lot of those legal challenges were around discrimination of Black people in the US. And then only 29% of 83% of approaches to diff were exploratory in nature. And so researchers were not engaging with what possible diff could be there, what have recent studies or past studies shown that would display diff. And so it's almost like if you throw a million darts at a board, some of them are bound to land. Yeah, I think that's it for this slide.
All right. So I know that we have thrown a lot of information and findings at you the past 25 minutes. So we just wanted to take a second or two to talk about what this may look like in practice. And so, sorry guys, for educators, these are some next steps that we have created based off of our findings. So we suggest that auditing and expanding your course materials each term, actually providing that spot to explore the contributions of Black scholars as foundational and not just supplemental. So auditing and expanding your course could just be like selecting one Black scholar to highlight and actually have an intentional lesson on their contribution in your course every semester. So starting small. Teach psychometrics alongside its historical context. Without that historical context, there is a lack of understanding of really what psychometrics meant and like what its implications were meant to be. And it's not a true understanding of what psychometrics is. And then finally, create structured and accountable mentorship opportunities. As we mentioned earlier, Robert Lee Williams had a lot of contributions towards graduate students' place in psychometrics, and one of his suggestions were to develop mentorship opportunities, intentional mentorship opportunities with Black students to help support them through these programs. Because if we want to diversify the field and the thoughts that are within the field of psychometrics, we have to nurture the students who are often underrepresented. I'm going to hand it over to Jaylin to talk about some of the implications for practitioners.
So how might practitioners use this in practice? We wanted to focus on specifically when a practitioner might be selecting assessment tools and what to consider when doing that. And so one thing we thought was to choose assessments that reflect participants' cultural backgrounds and lived experiences, involving participants in selecting or shaping the tools. And this could be done through a co-development, co-design approach, just to include all voices inside of the process. And reviewing each tool for biased language, images, or any assumptions before using them. And not to assume that just because a tool is validated that it's appropriate to be applied in all populations, but to critically interrogate why we're using a tool and if it's accurate for a specific population or if there needs to be adjustments made. And then when using group-based diff in your analysis, we want to account for the complexity and the intersection of race and ethnicity or other social or other salient social identities. Also to consider geographic location and field context when interpreting results. Clearly define and explain comparison groups and why you might be comparing one group to another and the intention behind that. And then also allowing participants to self-identify their group identity.
So that, oh, sorry, Jaylin, go ahead.
And so we wanted to end by sharing a few resources that we found helpful throughout our research. They're available if you scan that QR code, and they include a few examples of what questions to ask when implementing an anti-racist approach to evaluation, or how we might start centering cultural responsiveness and racial equity and measurement and evaluation. We also shared some resources that include research papers from past and present Black scholars who are or have put this work into practice. And so we want to take the time to thank you for coming and listening to our research and some of the work that we're doing. We really appreciate it. And I'll pass it over to Brianna. I'm not sure if you wanted to do the next slide.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we could pause here and give them a second if there's questions that we can answer, and if we have time, we can do the discussion questions.
Well, thank you, all of you. So everyone in the audience, if you have a question, you can either raise your hand and I can, come off mute and you can ask your question or make your comment, or you can put your question in the chat and I'll read it if that works better for you. But while people are, maybe thinking and getting their thoughts in order for questions, I have 3 questions. I'll ask just one at a time, not to bombard you. So I just recently read a book by Rebecca Solnit. She's writes on social commentary and takes interesting views of history and things like that. And I was just really struck on her very specific examples of in science, because it was so male dominated, white dominated, and male dominated, that the male scientists, I can't give you a time range, but we're just so embedded in thinking of hierarchy and things in conflict, and that's the way they would interpret the natural world. So they just couldn't even see that organisms were symbiotic. It took them a long time to accept that this lichen was actually 2 organisms working together. So it just didn't compute. Or that they assumed that the queen bee was actually a king bee. Yeah, and just it's not always there's a lot of cooperation in nature, and she was looking at that from a gender lens. So I'm just wondering if you guys, you gals, if those questions of gender raised in your mind too, because the examples that you point at are Black men. What do you think might be missing because we didn't have an early, perhaps a female influence in psychometrics, Black female influence even?
I can approach it. So many things. So specifically thinking about differential item functioning, there's a former professor at Howard University called Geranda Hughes, and she talks about differential item functioning that is not just based on statistics. And so she talks about, I think a lot of her dissertation and also her work afterwards also goes at this notion of sometimes it's differential response processing, right? Sometimes it's differential opportunities. And so I think what was missing from specifically was because there was this need to make it as technical as possible so that our tests can stand up to legal interrogation. We missed on all the other things that could be different or functioning differently within test takers. As one example of what was missed from the field. I think for us, a lot of the discomfort that we had that actually brought us to this research was, again, this notion that everything that we are reading is in opposition to who we are, right? And so being a Black woman, we don't see ourselves represented in the history, specifically with DIF. There's always a comparison group, and the comparison group has always been white. And so it had been a big reason why we came into the study to say, well, where did this actually start? And that led us into the unpacking of the relationship with eugenics. I don't know if that answers your question, Lori. You're muted, Lori.
Yeah.
Yes, we can move on. Sorry about that. Yeah, if anybody else has any questions, you can just come off mute or put your question in the chat. I'll go ahead and ask we have a raised hand. Yes, please come off mute and ask your question. I'm not gonna.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Uh, my question is actually you provided us several recommendations, among others, for educators and also for practitioners. Do you have any suggestions related maybe for the leadership of the educational institutions? Is there probably or maybe some of indicators that needs to be involved in the leadership of educational institutions to improve, to make some improvements in the context that you have presented today? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think some of our recommendations for educators could be applied also for leadership, but just thinking across the board, like I said, we all come from slightly different backgrounds. I think we have discussed the fact that there needs to be like some type of diversifying of curriculum across the board. Generally across curriculums and syllabus, like it's very um I'm trying to think of a politically correct way to say this, but it's only one perspective typically that we learn about in academic settings. There were some other suggestions that we had made for like trainings on bias that could be helpful from a leadership point of view, something that could be implemented to staff as well, like staff and faculty participating in types of bias training and what it could look like in developing curriculum, because a lot of times when we talk about bias, we talk about more like explicit bias, but these are things that people may not notice when they are teaching or implementing whatever curriculum they have in their classroom. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I hope it did.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. They usually say, people say it's not about what you expect, but what you inspect. So if we have some kind of indicators, maybe for the leadership that is defined in a way that you have suggested today, maybe we can achieve a greater impact. So thank you.
Thank you for your question.
I just wanted to say we added the QR code and a link as well in the chat.
Thank you for that. I was trying to do that too and wasn't very fast. I'm going to ask my second question. Can you speak to being culturally responsive versus maybe we would say culturally inclusive? And I'm thinking of situations when maybe there's like a study or an evaluation going on that is with a truly diverse group. And I don't mean diverse as a euphemism, meaning they're not white, but I mean like there are all kinds of people. And so if you're responsive to one group, you might be excluding a different groups. And then if that is an aspiration to be culturally inclusive, how do you do that?
I can take a stab at culturally responsive as opposed to culturally inclusive. Currently, I'm thinking through psychological diagnostic tools and coming to this realization that the construct is not the same. And so even as we think about autism as it presents in different intersections of our identities, not only is it about having a tool that is validated for all these populations, but also realizing that the actual construct is different, right? And so in that instance, I think being culturally responsive, especially as an evaluator, might mean using different tools for different parts of the populations, right? And I think the inclusivity piece is to move away from this binary comparison. So it's not always just about race, it's not always just about Black versus white, but it's about also recognizing one of the other insights that came from my studies, almost none of the diff analysis, in fact, not almost none of the diff analyses included American Indians as a population because the numbers are always small. But the fact that they're always small means it's never measured anyway. And so we continue to fail to collect evidence on how that specific population experiences the things or the constructs that we are measuring. And so and maybe that's how I would do it. So the responsiveness is to recognize that we can, as evaluators specifically, we can't just always inherit the psychometric validity evidence of the tools that we use because it doesn't always apply to all the groups, but also that it might mean we need to use different tools for different portions, or allow people to tell us how they identify or experience certain constructs.
It's fun being moderator because I get to ask all my questions. So I have another one. You ready? Okay. So in thinking about equity and promoting equity, it actually just recently was asked by a prospective group that we might work with about what is our capacity to disaggregate data based on race, ethnicity, income. And it was not just so much a technical, but a political. So sure, we can do that. There's no constraints on us. We can do it technically, but I am not clear on when it's appropriate to do that because it's important to show that there are inequities versus doing that and reinforcing the perception that there's certain groups that perform differently than other certain groups. And also being sensitive to this idea of stereotype threat that when women are constantly told, I mean, this is probably an old example, but women are, signaled that they're not good at math. And then so if you kind of remind a person that they're female and give them a math test, they do worse. So, I mean, if we extrapolate that to a larger scale, Black men drop out of college at higher rates than, but should we be saying that, or should we be that's not the story? And how do you promote equity? I'm going to stop blathering. I think you understand the tension I'm speaking to, I think. So
I think critical race theory gives a, I just want to say one small thing. I was going to say, I think critical race theory gives us a good approach to not blame race, right? Because race is not a variable that you change as you are running your regression or whatever you're doing, right? It's something that persists. And so understanding that where you see race, it's actually racism. So even in interpreting that Black men go to college at lower rates, colleges accept Black men at lower rates, right? And so flipping who is acting or what is acting away from the individual towards the system, I think allows us to disaggregate, but interpret in ways that can actually lead to change. Because if you just say, Black men go at reduced rates or females are not good at math, you're blaming the individual. But if you blame the system, then the changes can happen where it might actually make an influence. Yeah. And there's a lot of sorry. No. I was just going to say there are writings on how to do that flip when you are applying critical race theory to quantitative research.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's all in how we interpret. I think it's okay to disaggregate by specific groups, but interpreting it in a way that's meaningful and intentional. I know how I was taught, a lot of it is deficit based. This group performed better than this group, or this group is performing lower. But we can change our language and how we interpret results, how we draw conclusions, and thinking about the impact of our words on students. If there's a potential that this could be used for stereotype threat, what are ways we can talk about this in a way that's positive? Because I don't think there's anything negative about interpreting data, especially by group. I think it's how we do it, how we say it, and the conclusions that we draw from it. And I think going off what Malitsitso said, we can't blame a student based on who they are, where they come from. I think definitely calling out the systems and bringing in more theoretical reasoning for why we might be saying something is important, and how we might come up with solutions.
Eval Cafe has a question, so go ahead, Cafe.
Hi, this is Brad in the room. Thanks for your presentation. Kind of a technical question, I guess, but wondering if you have done any research or know of other research out there looking at sort of the difference between tests in regards to these types of issues and differences. And at the same time, as this information is coming out more, and hopefully there's more people thinking about it in the world of psychometric testing, do you see that, is there any improvement going on? Is it getting worse? Is it kind of staying the same in the world of educational testing?
Oh, what a depressing question. The depressing part is that it's not new. This information is not coming out more and more. There were people who were writing about this in the 40s, the 50s. And so sadly, this is not a new conversation that we are bringing. There are people who have had these insights and have brought them to light. You cannot find them in mainstream academic media, right? Some of the articles that we had to find when we were looking up Robert Lee Williams and Lloyd Bond, we had to go to a librarian to kind of unearth these materials. And so short of saying it's being hidden, is just to say this is not new. I think what needs to be different now is us as evaluators changing how we engage with it. And so if somebody says this is, and I'm going to use a popular example, the PHQ, right? Measuring depression levels amongst young children or participants. That is something that we assume measures this construct of depression in the same way. But actually going through that validity evidence and saying, well, in collectivist cultures, the way that these questions are asked does not get at the construct we're looking at. And so people tend to respond in relation to their group dynamics as opposed to what's affecting them on an individual level. And what we're seeing in psychology is that it has led to the gross underdiagnoses of certain populations because of the tools themselves. And so I'm not sure if I remember what your question was, but in terms of changing, I think evaluators who are also legitimate users of tests have the power to say, I'm going to seek a different tool. And as that tool is used more and more, I think we will begin to make progress. I don't think I understood the first question. Did you get a brief?
What was the first question? Was it an example?
From me? No, the question, I think you hit it. I was just sort of curious about, the current state of testing in terms of what research is out there about, just whether standardized testing is improving to be more inclusive, to be, I guess, to avoid these biases that you're talking about, or if it's getting worse.
I think in terms of education, there's some exciting work coming out of Jennifer Randall's research agenda, where she is deliberately creating anti-racist mathematics assessments. And so without not trying to be neutral or inclusive, but deliberately being anti-racist in the way that we come up with these. And so I think there is progress in terms of, in education specifically, trying to swing the pendulum so that the biases are addressed, and biases in the social context, not the technical context.
Right, I'm going to read a question from the chat. Goldie said, can you provide any examples of questioning, quote, standards in the same way you talk about questioning tests? I think some of the principles you shared similarly apply.
Standards in professions? Or
typing.
She said yes.
Said yes.
Oh, you. I don't know, maybe Brianna can talk about the evaluation standards. I mean, yes, academia in general, right? Because of the history, because of who had been excluded, I think is open to that critique on all fronts, honestly. As we think about tests, we think about curriculum as well, but I think even professional standards could be the same. I know a lot of professions are talking about cultural responsiveness, cultural awareness as an important part of being a professional. And again, we're not going to get it right immediately. So I think it's a work in progress.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that although there's a lot of attention to be culturally responsive, there's also this conversation with should there be separate culturally responsive goals, or should these be woven through our standards, which we often don't see. It's often similar to like how we talk about curriculum. It's an afterthought, not part of the mainstream conversation. So those are topics that we are familiar with, and I mean, an issue that is kind of similar to what happens in testing.
Right, and Jer have a question?
Yeah, not really a question, more just commentary. One, I appreciate this presentation and kind of removing myself from like the evaluator position and just thinking about like my own PhD experience recently with a background in sociology. I think these conversations are very important, but I also worry about the system just because now we have to change questions so much, or certain topics like critical race theory can't be talked about. So it was very nice and refreshing to hear about this because it's something I'm a big advocate of personally, but also something I'm very concerned about, just thinking about what things are currently at, especially in academia, PWIs, etc.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
I'm going to go ahead and ask another question. So a lot of colleges, are concerned, a lot of colleges and universities are concerned about equity and helping all students succeed. I'm wondering if you can help give us an example of how to flip the narrative the way this is talked about, because I think it's talked about like we want all students to be successful and we're going to give extra help to first gen, low income, Black and brown students. And there's nothing wrong with that, but is there a different way? It's focused on student success. We're going to help students be successful. And there's like this nagging feeling at me, like that it should be about how can the institution be better. But I don't know if you have suggestions on a way to like kind of get out of that traditional framing of certain kinds of students need more support, and they might, but I don't know, it seems to reinforce this narrative that, like an old narrative. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean that's the exact flip that you did there is it's not certain populations are not thriving. It's we are not able to get them through. And I think that's the flip. It's difficult to do, and in these tough political times, it's not fashionable to do, right? But I think those kind of efforts around having equity training for everyone who comes into contact with diverse students those are the things that are now illegal, right? Or will preclude you from funding. But that's exactly where the intervention should be targeted. Because it's not that, and I think that's where the testimonials were actually also very informative. It's not that Black students are deficient. It's not that they are struggling. It's that the system is created in ways that don't allow them to thrive, right? You almost have to be it's a bigger task for us. And so, I think about some of the work that Brianna and I had done around evaluation curriculum is even in the classes, just interacting with the curriculum, constantly being given this history that does not include Black theorists, right? Was it almost was, it increased the emotional labor. And so from the perspective of a program is thinking about what am I doing, or how is the way that I'm structuring the curriculum making it difficult for Black women, for instance, to thrive, right? How would you feel if you couldn't see yourself from first year all the way till you defended your dissertation, right? See yourself as someone who looks like you. And so flipping it from what about our environment is making it difficult, I think is the flip that we need.
Sorry, I was trying to arrange my screen so I could see if there's any more questions. Not seeing any more hands pop up or any questions in the chat. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Lots to think about. And I did add the couple links in the chat if people want to get on our mailing list. To hear more about Eval Cafes. There's also a link if you want to watch past recordings. There's a lot available online. This one will be posted as well, you know, in the next couple of days. And again, thank you for joining. This is the last Eval Cafe of this year, and it was really a wonderful ending. Thank you so much to all of you. Virtual claps.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.